Hey there! So, you probably see that I'm in my office today. I decided to give it a try, change up the scenery a little bit so you can see all this stuff back here. Sorry, it's crazy back there. Anyway, today let's talk about the Transcendentalist. So probably when you were reading through Emerson and Thoreau, you saw that they were written in kind of different time periods, but they sounded really, really similar. Well, that's for a reason. They actually were both part of a movement called the Transcendentalist, and a lot of people have always said they're kind of like hippies, and that makes sense. They both lived in this town called Concord. It's spelled Concord, but pronounced Concord, Massachusetts, and I'll talk about Emerson first, and then I'll tell you a little bit about Thoreau, and we'll move on. But Emerson was kind of an interesting dude. He had a little sadness in his life. He had a wife who died, and then he lost his faith as a Universalist minister. So then he toured around Europe, and then he came back. And when he came back, he remarried, but it was his first wife's money that allowed him to have the lifestyle that he lived, where he didn't really work. He just wrote about nature and things and philosophy. So that's kind of interesting. He actually owned Walden Pond, where Thoreau went into the woods and wrote Walden. Crazy, right? Yeah, there you go. Anyway, he was also a mentor to Henry David Thoreau. Now, if you think about Transcendentalism, probably, I would think you'd heard of Thoreau probably more than Emerson. Just because I feel like there's more famous quotes by him and people just love Thoreau. But so what this guy did is on July 4th, he went to the woods because he wanted to live life the way he felt he should and was intended to live life. Simply. Everything he did, he lived simply. So we have Emerson, who really saw this need for this connection to nature and God, and then we had Thoreau, who also saw a connection to nature, but he really wanted to use self-reliance and simplicity to kind of find that same thing. So they had kind of different beliefs. So, this movement did kind of putter out, and it really only existed wholeheartedly in Concord, Massachusetts. There were a few more people who were involved in it. One of the most famous is Louisa May Alcott's father, Bronson. He started a commune called the Fruitlands, and the thing that's interesting about this, and this is why I tell you about this, so he started a commune because he started a commune, and anyway, in this commune, all they ate were fruits, because they felt like that was the only way that they weren't offending anything in the universe. They only ate fruits. So they didn't wear wool because animals had to die to do that. They didn't use animals. They didn't eat animals. They were basically vegans. They were vegans, and they only ate not plants. They only ate fruits, and they thought it was really nasty to eat plants that grew downward, like a potato or a carrot. They were like, oh, that's nasty. I was like, that's so funny. They almost starved to death because obviously they were in New England and they almost starved to death. Then there was a few more communes that a few of them lived on. I think Thoreau might have lived on one, but actually Nathaniel Hawthorne definitely did. Emerson never did. So I think that's kind of interesting because Nathaniel Hawthorne, we see, kind of fits into a few categories. He's Gothic and Romantic and Transcendentalist. He's a cool guy. So, anyway, I'll stop talking about him. Okay, so, if you look at the PowerPoint that I did, I really think that would help you understand what I'm asking for when I say Transcendentalism. That's what I told you to do, so that's what you should have done. Anyway, so, there are a few tenets that I thought were more important than other. They kind of had rules, and so, one of the first ones was, there are a bunch of rules. And everybody has a different idea of what these rules are, so nobody has like a very consistent idea. So that's one of the biggest problems with Transcendentalism the way it was. Anyway, that they didn't have any rules. They didn't have any way to really come together except to say they were kind of Transcendentalists. They kind of respected nature, but there wasn't a whole lot to that. So there was one of the biggest problems. You know, some of them were vegans, some of them didn't mind eating anything. So there was one problem. And then another rule, which I do think is one that most people thought was really important, and one of the more important tenets of this philosophy, we'll say, was knowing oneself. They said that is, self-knowledge is the key to the universe. And we've heard that before, know thyself. It's always been really important. So just figuring out oneself is more important than just about anything else. But once you do that, you can discover the universe. But until you do that, you can't. So That's kind of how that works together. And I know there's one slide in there that talks about the overseer, and it's really interesting, but basically what they're saying there is, as a human, you need to know yourself, become one with the universe. I know if you're like sitting there and you don't like this, you're like, but I think it's worth reading. I think it's beautiful personally. Now, when I read it though, do I love reading Emerson? Absolutely not. Do I love reading a few sentences by Emerson? Wholeheartedly. So that's why I asked you to do the quotes the way I did, because I do think it's a lot easier to read these and just pick a few. Sorry, I've got some stuff up here. So, I do want to talk about just a few that I thought were really, really cool. Actually, the two Emerson quotes are on the PowerPoint as well. The page number is wrong, so I'll tell you what the actual page number is here. It's on page 217. And this is the most famous quote from anything Emerson wrote. Okay, you ready? So he says, "Standing on the bare ground, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball." Think about that. "I am nothing, I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God." You may be saying to yourself, wow, that's really interesting. But if you look on page 216, the thing that's so crazy about that is they actually have somebody who had drawn a transparent eyeball. So you have to think about that idea first, because that's the most famous image that's in here, this transparent eyeball. So what does an eyeball do? It sees. And if it's transparent, it doesn't get in the way. You can see through it. So there's this idea of somebody who is taking in everything but changing nothing. And so he talks about that, and then he also talks about being on the bare ground and egotism vanishing. So when he says egotism vanishes, I mean, what do we mean here? The sense of self, this person who you are on the outside, vanishes so you can become one with the universe. Some of my students love this, some of my students hate it. But, and then basically when one loses that egotism, is willing to take things in and willing to not affect anything, can they be part or particle of God? And so basically he's saying, once we can get rid of all these things that kind of inhibit us, we can become one with the universe and with God. Interesting. Yeah, that's one that I think is out there, and I love it. So, and then another great one on page 216. He says, "To speak truly, few adult persons can see nature. Most persons do not see the sun. At least they have a very superficial seeing. The sun illuminates only the eye of man, but shines into the eye and heart of the child." One thing that he talks about a lot is sight. He talks about eyeballs a lot. And he also talks about children. And when he talks about children, he kind of talks about their nature. And he says that, well, adults see the sun, and they see it for what it is, basically something that keeps us warm. But if you think about what you thought the sun was when you were like a 3-year-old, like this big ball that's hanging in the sky, you know, there's just a million things that we might have thought. And so when we're little, we see it for kind of what we think the universe wants us to see it. And when we are grown, we can't see that anymore. We see it for what it actually is, which is just this ball of gas. So basically he's saying that we're the smartest we're ever going to be the second we're born. And by then, everything else is affecting us. Everything else is changing the way we see things. And so really, really, the smartest we're ever going to be is the second we're born. After that, because it's the only time where nothing in the world inhibits us. It's the only time where we are truly ourselves. After that, we have some influence from our parents, and then the older we get, the more influence we get from the outside world. So, basically, he's saying that the child sees things probably the most naturally. Which is kind of cool, right? Beautiful. There's a few other quotes in there that I think are great. I love the one where he said that Adam talked to God. That was just a great one. But I'll move on because I'm talking forever. Okay, then I'm going to move from here to Thoreau. So I had a few quotes from Thoreau that I liked as well. Probably his most famous, and he actually has a few. Probably his is more, probably if you've ever talked to many people who just were nature enthusiasts, they quote Thoreau a lot of times. And so the first thing he says in Where I Lived, What I Lived For, on page 1028, he says, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see what I could not learn, what it had to teach, see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover I had not lived." And so basically here, he's talking about how he wants to go live with nature, see what nature can teach him, see what he can learn from it, and not fear when he died that he hadn't lived. Just beautiful, right? Okay, now this guy, again, there's a line in here where he says simplicity, 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 and then he talks about how a man is measured by the number of things he can let alone. So, there we go with that guy. He really was into simplicity. Again, though, he was living for free on somebody else's land, and most people have said, most historians have said, that he actually did go into town for dinner many nights. So, keep that in mind when you think about Thoreau. And then, one of my favorites, this is probably my favorite quote anywhere, I just love this quote. It's actually also on page 1028. I feel like that's the most beautiful page in this book. But, he says, the millions are awake enough for physical labor, but only 1 in a million is awake enough for effective intellectual exertion. Only 1 in 100 million to a poetic or divine life. To be awake is to be alive. I have never met a man who is quite awake. How could I have looked him in the face? So, if we look at that, we have to kind of say, where do we think we are? Are we the millions who are awake enough for physical labor? Basically, he's saying, well, that's not terribly hard. And then he says, only 1 in a million is awake enough for effective intellectual exertion. That's not very many, 1 in a million. I mean, you think about how many millions of people are on Earth. There's like 100 people. I guess. I'm not really good at math. Okay. Anyway, and so then he says he's not met anybody who is quite awake. So basically, he has this idea, and it's a little pretentious, I'm not going to lie. He has this idea that we're all sleeping. We're all asleep, and we've just not taken the time to have that poetic or divine life. And so you might want to think to yourself, well, who is truly awake? Well, that's your idea of what's going on here. But, so, this is a little introduction to the Transcendentalists. There is so much more out there, and if you like these guys, I would love for you to come in and talk to me about it, because they are one of my favorite groups ever of all time. Thoreau is absolutely my favorite. So, I think that's about it. You guys, make sure you're watching these things. They're going to be a lot easier. A lot of people have asked me, why don't you put it up before? Why don't you put it up before you make us turn in the assignment? Well, you guys, if I turned it in before you did the assignment, then you would have all the answers, and you wouldn't have to think. And that is not the point of this class. Do not be one of those people who's asleep. So, I'll post them later. Okay, nice talking to you. Bye.